The docking bay alarm was screaming before I even finished my first cup of coffee. I had owned Starport Velocan 9 for exactly 41 days, and in those 41 days, nothing had worked the way it was supposed to. The heating coils in Corridor 7 cycled on and off like a dying heartbeat. The gravity plating in the east wing ran about 12% heavier than standard, which meant every time I walked through it, I felt like I was carrying a second version of myself on my back. The main power relay hummed at a frequency that sat right behind my left eye and stayed there. And the beacon, that old automated distress loop the previous owners had left running, sang its ghost song into empty space every 6 hours like it was calling for someone who had stopped listening centuries ago. None of that had made the alarm scream. I set down my cup, which was a battered steel thing I had carried with me since my last posting with the Interspecies Commerce Bureau, and I walked to the security console. My name is Mauro Callum. I am 54 years old. I spent 30 years moving cargo, people, and occasionally classified items across 17-star systems for an organization that rewarded loyalty, with paperwork and competence with more paperwork. When I retired, I did not want a party. I did not want a speech. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far from schedules and supervisor calls and the particular sound a comm unit makes at 3 in the morning when something has gone wrong. 3 systems away, and apparently only I can fix it. What I found was Velocan 9. Listed in the Galactic Surplus Registry as a decommissioned waypoint station. Structural integrity rated at 62%. Last registered owner listed as a holding company that had dissolved 200 years ago. The auction price was so low I actually read the listing 3 times to make sure I was not misunderstanding a unit conversion. I was not misunderstanding anything. I paid for it. I packed 1 bag, 1 repair drone I had named Edgar after a particularly obstinate colleague, and enough instant meals to last a year. I signed the purchase certificate with a stamp that smelled like the inside of a forgotten drawer, and I flew out to the edge of the Duskram expanse, where gravity did strange things and no major shipping lane came within 4 light hours. And I moved into my starport. The alarm was still screaming. I pulled up the external sensor feed. The screen flickered twice, which it always did, and then it showed me the docking bay. Bay 1, the big one, the one I had spent 9 days repairing because the door mechanism had been fused shut by what looked like an old energy discharge, possibly from a weapon, possibly from something I did not want to think about too carefully. I had gotten it working again. I was proud of that. It had taken 3 replacement actuator arms, 6 hours of manual calibration, and 1 incident where Edgar had gotten his sensor array caught in the track, and I had to spend 40 minutes talking him back out in a calm voice, while he beeped in what I could only describe as panic. The door was open. I had not opened it. The alarm was telling me, in the way alarms do, which is to say loudly and without any useful context, that something had triggered the bay door mechanism from the outside. Not from my console. Not from any console inside the station. From outside. I stood in front of that flickering screen for a moment. The rational part of my brain, the part that had managed cargo logistics for 3 decades, began running through possibilities. Sensor malfunction. Automated response to a docking request I had somehow missed. A residual command loop in the system that I had accidentally activated during one of my repairs. All of these were possible. All of these were things I could fix. Then I saw the shape moving through the open door. It was a ship. But calling it a ship the way you would call a canoe, a ship felt wrong, in a way I could not immediately explain. It was long. Not large in the way that cargo haulers are large, which is a kind of blunt utilitarian bigness. This was long the way a sentence can be long, where every word has a reason, where the length is not excess but precision. It moved without sound, which ships do not do, not really. Not when they are entering an atmosphere-pressurized bay. There is always a shift in the air, a pressure change, a hiss from the vents. This thing moved and the air around it just made room, quietly, without complaint. Edgar beeped from behind me. It was his uncertain beep, the one that meant he had detected something his sensor categories did not have a proper label for. I knew exactly how he felt. I watched the ship settle into Bay 1 with a stillness that reminded me of something a very old person does when they sit down, carefully, in a chair they have sat in 10,000 times before. There was no fumbling, no adjustment. It simply arrived, and then it was still, and the bay door, which I had not touched, began to close behind it. I reached for the comm unit on the console. Standard protocol for unauthorized docking was to open a channel, identify yourself, state your business, and wait for a response. I had done this hundreds of times during my career, from the other side, announcing myself to port authorities who were half asleep and running on bad coffee. I lifted the comm and then I put it back down. There was no one on this station but me. I was the port authority. This was my starport. I picked up the comm again. "This is Velocan 9, I said. "You are docked in Bay 1 without a prior filed request. I am going to need you to identify yourself and state the purpose of your visit." The channel stayed open. I could hear the slight static that meant someone was listening. It lasted long enough that I began to wonder if I should repeat myself, which I was about to do. And then a sound came through that I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe properly. It was a voice, but it was also the feeling you get standing at the edge of something very large and very deep. Looking down, when your body knows before your brain does that the scale of what you are seeing is simply outside of what you were built to process. It was deep in a way that was not about volume. It was deep in the way that bedrock is deep. It said 2 words, "We remember." I stood there holding the calm. "That is not an identification," I said, "because I am who I am, and I had just spent 9 days fixing that bay door. And whatever was on the other side of it was going to follow basic docking protocol, or we were going to have a conversation about it." The channel clicked off. I put the comm down. I looked at Edgar. Edgar looked at me, or at least swiveled his sensor array in my direction, which was close enough. I went to find my toolbox because in my experience, whatever comes next, it is always better to have a wrench in your hand. The walk from the control room to Bay 1 took 4 minutes if you went through the direct corridor, which ran along the station's spine. It took 7 minutes if you went the long way, through the east wing, but I had learned to avoid the east wing in the morning because of the gravity. I went the direct route, Edgar rolling behind me, his wheels making the faint squeaking sound that meant he needed his axle joints greased, which I kept forgetting to do. The corridor was lit in the pale amber of the station's standard running lights. I had replaced half the light panels myself because several of them had failed years before I arrived and no one had bothered to fix them. The ones I had not replaced yet were dark, and the corridor moved between amber light and shadow in a rhythm that I had stopped noticing weeks ago. Now I noticed it again. The place felt different. It felt like it was paying attention. I pushed that thought away because it was not useful. The bay door was sealed. The inner door, the one between the docking bay and the pressurized interior of the station, had a manual lock, a sensor lock, and a magnetic seal. I had tested all 3 after I fixed the outer door, because that is what you do. I confirmed the bay pressure was equalized, which it was. Somehow, even though I had not run the pressurization sequence, the station had done it by itself. Or something had. I unlocked the inner door, it slid open, and the air that came through smelled like nothing I could name. Not like recycled station air, which always has a faint chemical undertone, like plastic and old filters. Not like the outside, which when the outer doors were open carried that particular cold, faint nothing that space-adjacent air carries, the smell of almost nothing. This was something else. It was the kind of smell that you would get, I thought, if you opened a room that had been perfectly sealed for a very long time, and inside that room, something very old had been sleeping. I stepped into the bay. The ship was even longer than it had looked on the monitor, now that I was standing next to it. Its surface was a color I found difficult to settle on. Dark, yes, but it shifted in the bay's amber lighting, catching the light in ways that did not quite correspond to its angles. It looked like it had been built out of something that had a different understanding of what surfaces were for. I was about to say something, the kind of professional something that 30 years of logistics had trained me to say in uncertain situations when the side of the ship changed. I say changed because I do not have a better word. There was no seam, no door mechanism, no hinge. A portion of the surface moved differently from the rest of it, and then there was an opening, and something came through. The first thing I noticed was the size. It was tall, taller than the standard station ceiling would have allowed, but the bay had a high ceiling, which was good, because it needed one. It was roughly humanoid in the way that a very old mountain is roughly humanoid, which is to say you can see the general shape, the vertical arrangement, the sense of a front and a back and sides, but the details are their own thing entirely. Its surface, and I use that word because skin does not seem right, was layered in a way that looked geological, like something that had grown over time rather than been born. Its eyes, when they found me, were the yellow of a star seen through a thick atmosphere, warm and distant and enormous. It looked at me for a long time. I looked back. Then it looked around the bay. It looked at the freshly calibrated door track. It looked at my repair patches on the wall, which were neat but obviously newer than everything around them, the way a clean bandage stands out on an old coat. It looked at Edgar, who had stopped rolling and was very quietly making his uncertain beep on a loop so low I could barely hear it. It looked at the crate of tools I had left in the corner when I was fixing the door, which I had meant to move back to the workshop and kept forgetting. Then it looked at me again. "You repaired this," it said. The voice was the same as through the comm, but in the open bay it had a physical quality, like bass frequencies finding the walls. "You are standing in my starport," I said, "and you docked without a filed request." It was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in its expression. though I could not have told you what specifically changed. Your Starport, it said. I have a purchase certificate. Another silence, long enough that I began to wonder if there was a translation lag, though the words had been clear enough. I built this station, it said. 4,116 years ago, I and 11 others of my kind, over the span of 63 years. I looked at the repair patches on the wall. I looked at Edgar. I looked at the door track that had taken me 9 days. I fixed the bay door in 9 days, I said. The creature looked at the door track. Yes, it said. I can see that. A silence settled over the bay that was not entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of two beings, both of whom had a claim to be where they were, trying to figure out what to do about the other. I had been in that silence before, in cargo disputes, in Port Authority standoffs, in one memorable occasion, involving a misdelivered shipment of something that turned out to be extremely important to 3 separate parties, none of whom wanted to admit it was theirs. The silence always meant the same thing. It meant both sides had decided the situation was more interesting than it was threatening. My name is Mauro Callum, I said. I am the registered owner of Velocon 9 as of 41 days ago. I would like to know who you are. The creature looked at me for what felt like a very long time. We are called the Vethali, it said. I am the last of those who built here. I came to see if anything remained. I gestured at the bay around us, the lights, the clean door track, Edgar, the crate of tools. Quite a bit remains, I said. Some of it I fixed myself. Can I get you anything? I have coffee. The Vethali looked at me. What is coffee? It said. It is a hot drink, I said. It helps. Helps with what? I thought about 30 years of logistics. I thought about the alarm that had woken me this morning. I thought about the bay door, and the strange-smelling air, and a voice like bedrock saying we remember through a comm channel on a station I had bought, for less than the cost of a decent second-hand cargo runner. Situations like this, I said. I made the coffee in the galley, which was off Corridor 3, past the door that I had relabeled with a handwritten sign because the original label had faded to nothing, and I kept walking past it. The galley was small, functional, and smelled like instant meals and the particular brand of instant coffee I had bought in bulk before leaving, which was not good coffee but was reliable coffee, which in my experience is more valuable. The Vethali did not fit through the galley door. We stood in the corridor outside it. Edgar parked a polite distance away, still making his very quiet, uncertain beep. I handed the Vethali a cup. It took the cup with the care that surprised me. The kind of careful that comes from being very powerful and very aware that things around you break easily. It looked at the cup for a moment, then it drank. Its expression did something complicated. It is bitter, it said. Yes, and hot. That is correct. And you drink this regularly. Sometimes twice. It looked at the cup again. I do not understand, it said, but I believe I do not need to. That was a fair enough position. I drank my coffee. It drank its coffee. The station hummed around us, its various systems doing the various things I had convinced them to do over the past 41 days, which was more than they had been doing when I arrived, and less than they were originally designed to do, and probably about right for a 54-year-old man living alone on the edge of an expanse that nobody visited. You repaired the power relay, the Vethali said. Rerouted it, I said. The original routing was losing about 30% to heat dissipation in the junction. I ran it through the secondary thermal exchange instead, dropped the loss to about 8%. The Vethali was quiet. We spent 3 years designing that relay junction, it said. The original design is still there, I said. I just added a bypass. You added a bypass, it repeated. I had the parts, I said. I used to manage logistics. I have a lot of parts. The Vethali looked down the corridor, toward the control room, toward the glowing panels and the labeled doors, and the places where I had fixed things that had been broken for longer than my species had known. What a starport was. Why, it said. I thought about that. I looked at my coffee. I could not leave something broken, I said. I have never been able to do that. My supervisors used to find it annoying. I was supposed to manage cargo, not personally rewire the Port Authority's power grid at the station on Sector 4, but the power grid was wrong, so I fixed it. And this station was broken. Most of it, I said. Some of it I have not gotten to yet. Corridor 9 is still a problem. The gravity plating in the east wing runs heavy. And the beacon, the Vethali went very still. What about the beacon, it said. Something in its voice had changed, not louder, not sharper, but denser somehow the way air gets before weather. It runs a loop, I said. Every 6 hours. It was already going when I arrived. I mapped it in my second week, figured it was an old automated signal, ghost code left in the system. I have been meaning to clear it, but I never got around to it because the relay and the door were more urgent. The Vethali set down its cup. It was not a quick movement. It was slow and deliberate, and when the cup touched the floor it made no sound. The Vethali straightened, which it had not been doing fully before. Perhaps out of consideration for the ceiling height. and straightened some more, and I became aware in a way that had not been fully clear to me before, of just how old and just how large the thing standing in my corridor actually was. Maro Callum, it said, and my name in that voice sounded like something being recorded for permanent keeping. I need you to show me the beacon. All right, I said. I picked up my coffee. Follow me. The beacon control was in the deepest part of the station, a level I had found on my third day when I was mapping the structure. I called it the basement level, because it sat below what I thought of as the main floor. Though the station did not have floors in the traditional sense, it had concentric layers, each one older and denser than the one above it, like rings in a very large, very strange tree. To get to the basement level, you went through a passage that I had marked on my map, with the words narrow and strange, because it was both of those things. The walls there were made of something that was not quite the same material as the upper levels. Smoother, darker. The amber running lights I had installed above did not seem to fully reach the surface, like the material was absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. The Vethali followed me down the passage without difficulty, though the space was tight even for me, and it was much larger. It moved through the tight space the way water moves, finding the room that was there rather than demanding more. The beacon room was circular, about 5 meters across, with a central column that rose from floor to ceiling and pulsed with a faint, steady blue-white light. Every 6 hours that pulse quickened, the light intensified, and a signal went out into space in a tight beam, aimed at nothing I had been able to identify, repeating a sequence I had recorded and filed under the note unknown origin, non-distress, investigate later. I had not gotten around to investigating later. The Vethali stopped when it entered the room. It looked at the column for a long time. You have been maintaining this, it said. It was not a question. Passively, I said. I stabilized the power feed to this level about 2 weeks in because the fluctuations were affecting the gravity plating above. Once the feed was stable, whatever was running here kept running. You stabilized the power feed, it said. The original routing was unstable. Same problem as the relay. I bypassed a damaged node and rerouted through the auxiliary. The Vethali moved toward the column. It raised one of its large layered hands and held it close to the surface of the pulsing light, not touching, just near it, the way you would hold your hand near a fire to feel the heat. This is not a beacon, it said. I stood in the doorway. What is it? I said. It is a promise, the Vethali said. Made 4,000 years ago to 3 civilizations who were trying to stop destroying each other. This signal is the anchor of a ceasefire treaty. As long as it transmits, the treaty is active. As long as it is active, the 3 parties are bound by its terms. I looked at the column. I looked at my power bypass, which ran along the base of it, neatly fastened, color-coded, labeled in my handwriting. And if it had stopped transmitting, I said. The Vethali lowered its hand. The treaty would have lapsed, it said. The binding would have dissolved. 3 civilizations with very old wounds and very long memories would have had no legal framework holding them apart. So when I was fixing the power feed, I said, you were maintaining the only legal instrument preventing a war, it said. I looked at my coffee cup. I looked at Edgar, who had followed us down and was parked in the corner, running his uncertain beep on a loop so quiet it was almost below hearing. I thought it was just a beacon, I said. The Vethali looked at me with its enormous amber-yellow eyes. Yes, it said. I understand that now. I sat down on the floor of the beacon room, because my legs had decided that was appropriate. I looked at the central column, pulsing its quiet blue-white light on its 6-hour cycle, doing exactly what it had been doing for 4,000 years, kept alive for the past 2 weeks by a power bypass I had installed because unstable power fluctuations bothered me. How long has it been since anyone checked on this place, I said. 840 years, the Vethali said. The last of us to tend it lost the means to return. We believed it had gone dark. It almost did, I said. The feed node was failing. Another few months and it would have dropped below minimum output. The Vethali was quiet for a long time. You arrived in time, it said. I arrived because the auction price was very low, I said. Yes, the Vethali said. And you fixed things because you could not leave them broken. That is correct. Maro Callum, it said. And again, my name had that quality of being kept somewhere permanent. I would like to understand more about why you do that. Things? Yes, I thought about it. Because broken things bother me, I said. And because fixing something, even a small thing, even a thing nobody else cares about, is the most straightforward good thing a person can do. You find the problem, you understand it, you solve it, the thing works. That is all. The column pulsed. The station hummed. Somewhere above us, the east wing's gravity plating ran 12% heavy, which I had not fixed yet and was now moving up on my priority list. Not because it bothered me, but because it occurred to me that if someone was coming to visit this station, they would probably prefer not to feel like they were carrying a second version of themselves through the east wing. What happens now? I said. Now, The Vethali said, I must tell you something about the 3 civilizations whose treaty this station anchors. All right, I said. They do not know the station is still active, it said. They have not received confirmation of this signal in centuries. They have been, in recent decades, testing the edges of the boundaries the treaty established, probing, shifting, the kind of movement that happens when nations believe no one is watching and no agreement is truly enforced. I looked at the column. They are going to find out, I said. The signal has been strengthening, the Vethali said. Since you stabilized the power feed, they will have detected the change within the past week. They will be responding to it. Responding how? The Vethali looked at me. By coming here, I stood up. How many ships, I said. 3 fleets, it said. 1 from each signatory. I thought about Bay 1, which held 1 ancient ship. I thought about Bays 2 through 6, which I had not fully repaired, though 3 and 4 were at about 80%, and could probably receive vessels in a careful approach. I thought about the galley, and how much coffee I had, and whether I had enough cups. When, I said. Based on the signal change, the Vethali said, I estimate between 40 and 60 hours. I picked up my coffee cup. All right, I said. We have work to do. Edgar beeped. This time it was not the uncertain beep. It was the beep he made when I picked up my toolbox and he understood that the day was going to be long and complicated and that we were doing it anyway. I appreciated that about Edgar. I went to find my toolbox. 42 hours. That was how long we had, in the end. 42 hours from the moment the Vethali told me 3 fleets were heading toward a starport that had 1 working docking bay, a gravity problem in the east wing, a coffee supply I was now watching with concern, and a single registered owner who had bought the place because he wanted to be left alone. I spent the first 6 hours doing what I always did when a deadline appeared. I made a list. The list was not short. Bay 3 needed its docking clamp system recalibrated. Bay 4's pressurization valve was functional but slow, about 3 times slower than standard, which meant a ship coming in on Bay 4 would have to wait 12 minutes for pressure to equalize before they could open their hatch, and in my experience, beings who arrived in warships did not appreciate being asked to wait 12 minutes. The main communication array, the one that served the upper level and could broadcast on interspecies standard frequencies, had been running on a partial power draw because I had prioritized the beacon and the relay. I needed to bring it to full capacity. The conference room, which I had found on my 3rd week in a level I had labeled secondary operations on my map, had not been opened in what appeared to be centuries. Its door was sealed not by lock but by time, by the simple fact of nothing moving for so long that moving became very difficult. And the east wing gravity problem. I had been putting that off. I was not putting it off anymore. The Vethali worked alongside me. I want to describe that accurately, because it was not what I expected. I expected observation. I expected the kind of presence a very important person provides when they are watching you work, which is the feeling of being watched while you work, which makes the work harder and the outcome more self-conscious. The Vethali did not do that. It asked questions, good questions, specific questions, the kind of questions that meant it understood what I was trying to do and wanted to understand how I was going to do it. The clamp system, it said, standing in Bay 3 while I ran a calibration sequence. Your method is different from the original mechanism. The original used a torque-based lock, I said. The torque assembly is partly degraded. I am using a magnetic lock instead. It is simpler and the components are in better shape. The function is the same. The original was better, the Vethali said. The original is not available, Papa says. Yes, it said. I see. The Vethali was several thousand years old and had helped design the original systems of this station, down to the molecular level of the materials used in its walls. It also, I was discovering, had a relationship with imperfection that was not entirely natural to it. The original was better. The original torque assembly was a masterwork of engineering. The original relay routing had been designed after 3 years of precise calculation. The original beacon column had been built to last until the universe grew tired. The original was also, in many cases, no longer fully here. I had been working with what was here. The pressurization valve on Bay 4, I said, during hour 9, while I was elbow deep in a panel that smelled like old ozone and something else I preferred not to identify. Can you tell me anything about the original design? There is a secondary intake here that I have been feeding manually. If there is a way to automate it, I can cut that 12-minute wait down to maybe 4. The Vethali crouched beside me. For such a large being, it crouched well. It looked at the panel. Then it reached in beside my hands, and with a precision that was very quiet and very certain, it touched 2 points inside the panel that I had not recognized as anything in particular. Something clicked. The valve hissed and ran a pressurization cycle in under 3 minutes. I looked at my hands. I looked at the panel. There is a manual trigger node, the Vethali said. We included them in all secondary systems, for maintenance. My schematics did not show it, I said. The schematics that survived were not complete, it said. Much was lost. I closed the panel. What else is in there that I do not know about? I said. The Vethali was quiet for a moment. Many things, it said. I will show you what I remember. That was how the next 30 hours went. I had my tools, my parts, my habits, my workarounds. The Vethali had its memory, which was not perfect after 4,000 years but was considerably better than a faded schematic and a lot of guessing. We worked around each other in the way that two people work together when they are not yet comfortable, but they are both professional enough to know that the job is more important than the comfort. Edgar followed us everywhere. Occasionally the Vethali would look at Edgar, and Edgar would beep, and the Vethali would look thoughtful. By hour 20, bays 3 and 4 were ready. Bay 5's outer door was a problem I decided to leave alone, because the mechanism was different from Bay 1's and I had run out of replacement actuator arms. By hour 28, the communication array was at 94% capacity, which I considered acceptable. By hour 36, the conference room door was open. The room inside swept clean by Edgar's intake fans, the long table inside visible in the amber light, its surface undamaged, the chairs around it still in the positions they had been left in the last time someone sat in them, centuries ago. The Vethali stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. The last meeting held here, it said, ended the fracture wars. I looked at the table, I looked at the chairs, and the next meeting, I said, is in about 6 hours. Yes, the Vethali said. I should mention, I said, that I am not a diplomat. I know. I was a logistics manager. I understand. My qualifications for hosting an interspecies treaty negotiation are not strong. The Vethali looked at me. You have maintained the treaty anchor for 41 days without knowing you were doing so, it said. You have brought 3 docking bays to functional status in under 2 days using parts from your personal supply and knowledge you built over 30 years of work. You have found solutions to problems I believed required our original design team to address, using what you call workarounds, which function as well as the originals and in one case better. I thought about the relay bypass. The relay bypass does run better, I said. You are the registered owner of this station, the Vethali said. That makes you, by the terms of the original treaty framework, the station's neutral authority. The 3 parties must deal with you before they deal with each other. I looked at the conference room. Do the 3 parties know that? I said. They will when they arrive, it said. I took a breath. Right, I said. I am going to need more coffee. The Kreth came first. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. The way the order in which things happen at a meeting always matters. Whoever arrives first is either eager or anxious or both, and knowing which one takes careful watching. The Kreth vessel entered through Bay 3, which I had spent 6 hours on, and which worked perfectly, and I made a private note of satisfaction about that while I watched it on the monitor. The Kreth were tall, gray, segmented along the torso in a way that gave them a slightly formal appearance even in casual posture, and their senior representative, who identified herself as Delegate Ora Van, had the specific quality of someone who had been briefed very thoroughly on a situations and was trying not to show how unsettled she was by what briefing contained. I met her at the bay door. You are the station authority, she said. She was looking past me at the corridor, at the labeled panels, at Edgar, at the general evidence of recent human habitation, which probably did not look the way she had expected an ancient treaty station to look. Maro Callum, I said, registered at owner. Welcome to Velocane 9. The conference room is on the secondary level. There is coffee available in the galley. I would ask you to wait in the conference room until the other delegates arrive. She looked at me. Other delegates, she said. The Salan Compact and the Duskram Hive, I said. I expect them within the hour. Her expression went through several things quickly. They are coming here, she said. You are all coming here, I said. That is generally what happens when a treaty station sends out a strengthened anchor signal. Would you like some coffee while you wait? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes, she would, and I led her to the galley, and then to the conference room, and I left her there with a cup, and the view of the long table, and the empty chairs, and whatever that room does to a person when they walk into it and understand what it is. The Solen arrived 20 minutes later. Their delegate was a man named Councillor Edmund Gray, compact and careful in his movements, with the particular stillness of someone who has been in difficult rooms before, and knows how to take up the minimum amount of space while watching. Everything. He accepted coffee. He sat at the table. He and Delegate Van did not speak, but they were aware of each other in the specific, precise way of people who have been watching each other across a border for a long time. The Duskram took the longest. Their vessel came in on Bay 4, and the pressurization ran in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which I was quietly pleased about. Their representative was a being called Navigator Prime Lena Marsh, which surprised me because I had not known the Duskrim used such human-sounding names, and she told me when I mentioned this, that her people had been trading with a human colony in the outer Duskrim range for 60 years and names had traveled both ways. She took coffee and said it was better than the variety her colony neighbors used, which I thought was a reasonable opinion. When all three were seated at the table in the conference room, and I was standing at the far end with my coffee and Edgar parked quietly by the wall, I became aware that I needed to say something. I was not a diplomat, I was not a treaty negotiator, was not in any formal sense qualified to open this meeting. I was, however, a man who had run cargo logistics across 17-star systems for 30 years, which meant I had run more meetings than I could count, in more difficult circumstances than most people sitting in offices would believe, with more parties who did not want to be in the same room than most treaty bodies would face in a decade. I looked at the three delegates. You each received an enhanced signal from this station, I said. The signal is the anchor of the Treaty of Velocon, signed in this room. At this table, 4,016 years ago. The signal has been active this whole time. I have been station's authority for 41 days. I did not know the signal was a treaty anchor until 42 hours ago. I have spent the last 42 hours making sure that this station is ready to receive you. I looked at each of them in turn. The treaty is still in effect, I said. It has been in effect the whole time. Every action your governments have taken in the border regions over the past centuries has occurred under the terms of that treaty, whether or not you believed it was still active. I want to be very clear about that before anyone says anything else. The room was quiet. Delegate Van said, "Treaty is believed to be lapsed." It was not lapsed, I said. The anchor signal weakened. It did not stop. There is a difference. Councillor Gray said, "By what authority do you make that determination?" "By the authority of the station's operating records," I said, "which I have been reading for 6 weeks not knowing what they were, and which I can provide in full to any legal body that wishes to review them. Also by the authority of the registered deed of ownership, which is filed with the Galactic Surplus Registry and is not in dispute." Navigator Prime Marsh had been very still since she sat down. She was looking at the table. Then she looked up. "You said you did not know what the signal was," she said. "What did you think it was?" "A ghost loop," I said. "Old automated code left in the system. I was going to clear it, but I kept prioritizing other repairs." She looked at me for a long moment. "And yet you maintained the power feed that kept it running," she said. "The power feed fluctuation was affecting the gravity plating upstairs," I said. "I fixed the feed because unstable power irritates me." Another quiet. I drank my coffee. "The treaty has terms," I said. "I have read them. I made annotations because I find annotating documents helpful when I am trying to understand them. I am going to read the relevant sections to you now. Then we are going to discuss the specific border actions from the past 30 years that are in conflict with those terms. I have a list. It is organized by category and date." I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the folded sheets I had printed from the station's archives, covered in my own handwriting in the margins, with the annotations I had made while mapping the station, not knowing at the time that I was reading a live diplomatic document. Councillor Gray said, "You made annotations." "I annotate everything," I said. "It helps me follow the logic." Delegate Van looked at the sheets in my hands, then at me, then at the room around her, the ancient table, the chairs, the amber light on walls that had stood for 4,000 years and were standing still. "You fixed this place," she said. It was not a question. She was saying it the way you say something when you are arriving at an understanding. "It needed fixing," I said, "and now you are going to read us our treaty." "The relevant sections," I said. "It is a long document. I have marked the pages." The Vethali, which had been standing in the doorway behind me in a silence so complete I had almost forgotten it was there, made a sound. It was a very quiet sound, and I did not know what it meant in the Vethali's language, if it had one in the traditional sense, but it had the quality of something being recognized after a very long search. I unfolded the first page. "Article 1, I said, territorial integrity and the definition of neutral space. I am going to skip the preamble because it is mostly formal language about the architect's role as neutral builders, which is relevant to legal standing but which we can return to if needed. We will start with the actual terms." Nobody argued, so I read. I read for 2 hours. I did not read everything, but I read the sections that mattered, the ones I had flagged with small paper tabs I had cut from the margin of one of my repair notes, because I had not brought any proper bookmarks to a decommissioned starport in the middle of nowhere. The three delegates listened. They did not interrupt often, and when they did, the interruptions were the kind that meant they were following along, not the kind that meant they were trying to derail things. That was a good sign. In my experience, The people who interrupt to show they are not listening interrupt differently from the people who interrupt because they are paying. Close attention. Delegate Van interrupted 3 times. All 3 times it was to ask for a clause to be reread, which I did. Counselor Gray did not interrupt at all, which could mean many things, and I watched him the way I used to watch the quietest person in a cargo dispute, which was carefully. Navigator Prime Marsh interrupted twice, and both times it was to ask about the definitions section at the back, specifically about what the treaty considered a neutral corridor versus a buffer zone, which told me the Duskram had been doing something in the past few decades that was right on the edge of that distinction, and they knew it. I flagged those pages for later. When I finished the main reading, I put the pages down and looked at all 3 of them. I have a list, I said, of 37 specific actions taken in the border regions over the past 30 years, organized by date and type. I am not going to characterize these actions. I am going to read them and cross-reference them against the relevant treaty articles. We are going to do that together. Then, we are going to have a conversation about what the current state of the treaty boundary looks like and what, if anything, needs to be addressed. Delegate Van said, "This is not standard diplomatic procedure." "I am not a diplomat," I said. "I am the station authority. This is how I run meetings." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "All right." Counselor Gray, still quiet, nodded once. Navigator Prime Marsh said, "How long have you been in logistics?" 30 years, I said. She nodded, as if this explained everything, which perhaps it did. We went through the list. It took 3 more hours. The galley ran out of the good coffee at hour 2 and I switched to the backup supply, which was not as good but was hot and present, and in my experience that is often more important than quality. I kept cups filled. I brought in the food I had, which was instant meals, and I was aware this was not the level of catering appropriate to an interspecies diplomatic summit, but nobody complained, and Delegate Van actually said the meal was efficient, which I took as a compliment. The 37 actions broke down as follows. 11 were in direct violation of the treaty. 14 were in the unclear zone between treaty terms, the buffer versus corridor question that the Duskram had been circling. 12 were either compliant or so old, they predated the period the treaty's enforcement clauses covered. I went through all of them. I was precise. I was not dramatic about it. When I said something was a violation, I cited the article number and read the relevant clause again. When I said something was unclear, I explained why and asked the relevant party to provide their characterization. The relevant parties provided their characterizations. Sometimes they argued, not with me, with each other, which was fine, which was actually the point. They had not argued with each other, in any formal way for a very long time, because there had been no framework to argue within. Now there was a framework. It was a table and a document and a man with annotations and backup coffee and a repair drone in the corner. It was not a perfect framework, but it was here, and it was working. At hour 6, I called a recess. I told them they had 30 minutes and they should stand up, move around, and come back. 3 ancient civilizations with fleets parked in the space around my starport took their 30 minutes and came back. That was, in my private opinion, the moment I stopped being concerned about the outcome. Because people who come back after a recess have decided, on some level, that the meeting is worth continuing. That is not a small thing. I have been in meetings where people did not come back from recess. The meetings that end that way end badly. These 3 came back, and Delegate Van had apparently spent part of her recess looking at the corridor, labels I had put up, because she said while sitting back down that my labeling system was unusual. I could not find the original labels on most of the doors, I said, so I made my own. The label on Corridor 3 says the door smells like old boots, she said. I had just fixed something behind it, I said. The smell was notable. I wanted future me to know in advance. Counselor Gray made a sound. I was fairly sure it was what passed for a quiet laugh. Navigator Prime Marsh said, "Future you." "I make notes for future me," I said. "It is a habit. 30 years of logistics teaches you that past you is often the only person who knows what present you was thinking." We went back to work. At the end of hour 8, which was late enough that the station's standard running lights had shifted to their dimmer night setting and the coffee was a memory, we had a document, not a new treaty, a clarification addendum to the existing one, 14 pages, written by hand on paper I had in my supply kit, drafted and redrafted and agreed on line by line. It addressed the 11 violations with defined remediation timelines. It resolved the buffer versus corridor question with a specific geographic definition that all 3 parties signed on to. It reaffirmed the anchor signal as active and the treaty as binding. I signed it as the station authority. The 3 delegates signed it as the representatives of their respective civilizations. The Vithali signed it as the station's original architect. And then we all sat there for a moment, In a room that had last seen a document signed 4,000 years ago, the coffee gone and the food gone, and Edgar in the corner, and the station humming its various hums around us. Delegate Van said, "How did you know what to do?" "I thought about that." "I did not," I said. "I just ran the meeting the way I run every meeting. Find the problem, understand it, work through it, keep everyone's cup filled." "You made us wait in a queue when we arrived," Counselor Gray said. It was the most he had said at once all day. "Bay access was limited," I said. "I only had 3 working bays. You had to come in one at a time. I arrived second," he said. "I waited 20 minutes. "I know," I said. "I timed it." He looked at me. "No one has made the Selen Compact wait in a queue in 400 years, he said. "I apologize for the inconvenience," I said. "I did not say it was an inconvenience," he said. "I said no one had done it. There is a difference." He sounded, I thought, mildly satisfied about it, as if the queue had been, in some small way, a relief. I thought about that on the walk back to the control room afterward, when the delegates had returned to their ships for the night, and the Vithali had gone somewhere in the deep levels of the station, in the parts I had not yet mapped, to do whatever 4,000-year-old beings do when they are alone. I made a cup of the backup coffee, the not good kind, and I sat in the control room and I looked at the monitor that showed the docking bays and the space beyond them, and the shapes of 3 fleets hanging in the dark out there, enormous and old and full of people who had almost been at war 3 days ago. Then I looked at my coffee. Then I looked at Edgar. "We are going to need a proper coffee supply," I said. Edgar beeped. It was his agreement, beep. "And I need to fix the east wing gravity," I said, "before someone visits that corridor and has a bad experience." Edgar beeped again. "Also," I said, "I need a better cup." The station hummed. Outside, the 3 fleets stayed where they were. The beacon column, deep in the basement level, pulsed its blue-white light on its 6-hour cycle, the same as it had been doing for 41 days, the safest as it had been doing for 4,000 years, kept alive now by a power bypass and a stubborn habit, and the fact that I could not broken thing alone. I drank my coffee. It was not good coffee, but it was here and it was mine, and the silence around it was different from the silence I had come looking for. This silence had something in it. Not noise, not the kind of noise I had been running from for 30 years, but the sound of things continuing, of a station that worked, of a treaty that held, of 3 civilizations that had sat at a table and argued about clauses and drunk inferior coffee and come back after a recess. I had bought this place for quiet. I had not bought it to be useful. I had not bought it to be important. I had not bought it to fix things, not deliberately, though I had known myself well enough to pack Edgar and a full set of tools before I came. The Vithali found me there an hour later. It came in with its usual quiet and stood behind me and looked at the monitors. "They are still here," it said. "They will start formal communications with their home governments in the morning," I said. "The ratification process will take time, but the addendum is signed, and the anchor is active, and the framework is established. They will stay until they have confirmation their transmissions have been received and acknowledged. And then?" "And then they go home," I said, "and presumably argue about the specifics in their own halls, which is their right. But the treaty holds. The station will need to be formally registered as active again, which means dealing with the Galactic Surplus Registry, which is going to be an interesting conversation." The Vethali said nothing for a moment. "I want to ask you something," it said. "Go ahead," I said. "I came here to see ruins," it said. "I came to find what was left. I did not expect to find this. A retired engineer in your starport? A station that works," it said. "A framework that held. A person who fixed things not because they understood what the things were, but because the things were broken." I looked at my coffee cup. "I spent 30 years," I said, "moving things from one place to another. Cargo, people, information, making sure things arrived where they were supposed to arrive. I was good at it. I was very good at it. But I always thought of it as just work, just logistics, the infrastructure behind the things that mattered. And now," the Vithali said, "and now I think the infrastructure is the thing that matters." I said, "The relay that runs clean, the door that opens when it should, the signal that transmits on schedule, the framework that holds, not the grand gestures, not the history, just the thing that keeps working because somebody kept it working." The Vithali was quiet for a long time. "I would like to stay," it said, "if that is acceptable to you." I looked at it. "You want to stay on the station?" "Not as its owner," it said. "You own it. The deed is legitimate. I want to stay as its archivist. There is much here that I remember, which has not been recorded. And there is much here," it said, looking at my labeled panels and my repair notes, and Edgar and the whole inhabited, functional, stitched-together reality of the place, that I do not know, which I would like to understand. I thought about it. "There is one condition," I said. "Name it." "Corridor 9, I said. "I have been trying for 3 weeks to understand the geometry of Corridor 9. It does not connect to anything logically. The angles are wrong. I have drawn 4 maps of it and none of them are consistent. I need you to explain Corridor 9 to me. The Vithali looked at me. Corridor 9, it said slowly, was designed as a resonance chamber. It was meant to amplify the beacon's signal under certain conditions. The geometry is not architectural in the conventional sense. I looked at my maps. A resonance chamber, I said. Yes. That is why my gravity plating fix in the east wing changed the signal frequency 2 weeks ago, I said. I wondered about that. You noticed the frequency change? I log everything, I said. The Vethali looked at me for a long time. Show logs, it said. So I did. We stayed in the control room until the first light cycle, when the station's running lights shifted back to their standard amber and the monitors showed the 3 fleets still out there, in the quiet of the duskgrim expanse, holding their positions, which was a very different thing from the positions they had been holding a week ago, which was readiness, which was all the language a weapon knows. Now they were waiting. Waiting is a different kind of holding. Waiting means you expect to be somewhere and you are taking the time to arrive there, properly. I did not buy this starport to save anyone, I want to be clear about that. I bought it because the price was low, and the location was far from everything, and I was tired in the specific, bone-deep way of someone who has given 30 years to a job that asked for 30 years and received them, and I wanted a place where the only things that needed fixing were the things I chose to fix. I have a theory about humans, and I want to say it plainly, because this is my account and I am allowed to have theories in my own account. We cannot leave broken things alone, not because we are heroic, not because we are ambitious, not because we have some grand instinct toward fixing the universe. It is simpler than that. A broken thing is a problem. A problem has a solution. Finding the solution requires paying attention, which requires caring, which requires the kind of investment that turns, over time, into something that matters. I invested in a power relay because unstable power irritated me, and then the relay was stable, and the beacon ran, and a treaty held, and 3 civilizations sat at a table in my conference room and argued about clauses, and came back from recess and signed a document that I wrote, the header on by hand, because we had run out of the printer's good paper, and I had to use the back of a repair note. The back of the repair note said, on the other side in my own handwriting, Bay 4 valve, check manual trigger nodes, ask the Vethali. It is a good document for a treaty addendum header to be written on, I think. It is honest about what kind of place this is. It is a place where things get fixed, where things get checked, where you ask the person standing next to you what they know, because they might know more than you expect, and you might know more than either of you anticipated. And between the two of you the problem becomes smaller and then solved. The east wing gravity is still 12% heavy. I have it on my list. The Vethali is learning what a spreadsheet is. Edgar needs his axle joints greased. The coffee supply situation is urgent. I did not find the silence I came for. But I found something better, which is the kind of silence that lives inside a working thing. A thing that runs, a thing that holds, a thing that does what it was always meant to do. That silence lives in the hum of the relay and the pulse of the beacon and the sound of a treaty being real again after 800 years of being believed lost. I can live in that silence, I think I will.